Woodworking is really all about techniques. You know, I've spent 50 years learning woodworking techniques, which I use on the various projects that I build. And I love sharing those techniques with you, my viewers, when I'm making various projects. So what we've done here is we've taken a collection of those techniques that I've shared in the past, the ones we think are the best, and we've put them together to make this video compilation. Share with you the best of my techniques. So come on, I don't care if you're a new woodworker or you've been at it a while, there's probably something in here that you can use that can help you on your next project. This particular project is assembled with pocket holes, and to do pocket holes you need a pocket hole jig. Now there are several on the market. This particular one is made by Craig. It is not the lowest end one, and it's not the highest end one. It's like one step up from the low end. It's essentially we could call it the better home workshop one, okay? Going up from here, the next one up would probably be something you would use more in a cabinet shop, like if you're doing production work. So what is a pocket hole, first of all? All right, I've got a little sample I've made here where I put a pocket hole together and then taking the screws out and cut it apart. And what we're doing is we're creating a pocket for the screw to go in so that the screw will not be visible from the surface. Now, this is really useful in a lot of places where you may need to join two wood together like that, or even like that, and you don't want any sort of hardware visible. An obvious place for that would be like cabinet facing. You know, if you look at your kitchen cabinets, you've got a frame around the door that the door is mounted to. Well, somehow you've got to take and do a butt joint there, but still make it strong. Now, the old way would be to use a mortise and tenon. Somebody came up with the idea of the pocket hole as an easier way of assembling it. Okay, doing a mortise and tenon takes some skill and some practice. Doing a pocket hole, well, it's actually pretty easy. The idea is that the hole is always drilled from the non-visible sides. If I was doing this pocket hole and this was a piece of a cabinet facing, this would be the inside, or I should say this side would be the inside, where people aren't going to be able to see it, not the outside. But let's say you do it on the outside. Okay, so here's another pocket hole drilled into a piece of wood. Now, I've gone ahead and stained this dark so you can see where the hole is. And this is a piece of 3/8 inch dowel rod, and that just slips right in there. And then once that's glued, that could be flush cut and sanded, and they're making a very effective plug. So how do we use this tool? The idea is that we first need to mark where we want to put our holes, okay? The drawings don't give us dimensions, and they aren't really that critical. But here's what I did. On the top shelf, or the top in the shelf, I've gone ahead and made my lines 1.5 inches from the edge. That's pretty good. That splits up the area nicely. For the back, I also went 1.5 inches from the edges, but I had to add 2 more in, and it turns out that the space between those two tick marks, or those 2 lines, is 15 inches, so I just divided it in thirds. So I've got 1.5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches, 1.5 inches. So you don't have to do it that way, that's the way I did it. Now I'm going to drill this hole down till I hit my stop, okay? Now I'll move over and do the same thing on the other hole. So this end piece will be on here, and this can be attached like this, okay? I've got my pocket screws. Now you use special screws for this, okay? They're kind of a washer head screw with a coarse thread, which holds really well. They're also a thread cutting screw, so that's part of why we don't have to put a pilot hole in. They come in different sizes, and you have to make sure you use the right size for the thickness of the material you're working with. And I've got a long square bit that came with the set, okay? You can buy those separately, but that came with the set, and that's the way it's going to be attached together. I'm going to go ahead and put some glue on here. I'm sure that these pocket screws will hold this together even without the glue. There's no such thing as making something too strong. Okay, so I've got that piece ready, and now I'm going to take my end. Now remember, the hole is always drilled in the piece that's going into the other one, okay? I've got my hole there. You could line this up with a corner clamp, and that might actually be better. One nice thing about working with pocket joints is that if you get a little off, it really isn't going to hurt anything. The main reason I'm concerned about centering it properly is appearance more than anything else. If my holes are a little crooked or they're a little off center, it's still going to join. I don't have to match up with other holes in another piece of wood. Now, one of the nice things about pocket jigs is that it gives you this capability. Most of the time, pocket jig holes are used and pocket hole joinery is used when you've got a hidden situation, like the face frame of a cabinet, and you're putting the pocket holes on the inside. But every once in a while, you get a situation where you want to use this form of joinery, but it's going to be visible. Okay, so here's how you solve that problem, okay? The holes, pop in a piece of dowel rod. Now I'm using 3/8 inch dowel rod here for this because the holes are 3/8 of an inch in diameter. That's logical, right? And the pieces I've cut are 2 inches long, which is just about right for this particular application. So I'm just putting a little glue around the end of it, because when you put a dowel rod into a hole, the wiping action actually spreads the glue out. So we put those in there, we let the glue dry, and then we're going to cut them off and sand it, and that'll give it a more finished look. We won't have those holes visible. It's been a couple of hours now since I went ahead and glued these dowel pins in, and so now all I've got to do is cut them off and sand it smooth. You'll need a flush cut saw of some sort for this. There's several different ones around. This is one by Dowels that I particularly like. And it's fairly easy to cut them off. I mean, we're not talking a very thick piece of wood. And once those are cut off, quick work with the sander will smooth it out the rest of the way. There's a couple different ways we can cut this. One is to use a handheld jigsaw. Another one is to use a handheld circular saw. You can have the same problem with either one of those saws, and that is trying to stay right on that line. So let me show you a little different way to cut that line. As a general rule of thumb, if you want a straight cut, you don't want to depend on your eye and your hand. You want to depend on something that's straight. So that means a straight edge, whether that be a ruler of some sort or a piece of off-cut wood that you know is straight because you've compared it either to a straight edge or to your bench top, like I have with this one. Because this is a small piece, I really can't clamp this with clamps, because if I put the clamps there, then if they're hanging off this side, then they get in the way of my saw. If they're hanging off that side, I can't clamp that down, so that gives me a bit of a problem. So I'm going to use my standby clamp. Now I've already measured the distance from my blade to the edge of the shoe here. I know that's 1 inch. I've gone ahead and here's my line. I've drawn a couple little tick marks that show me where that 1 inch is. Tear myself off a piece of masking tape. This is a standby clamp for whenever other clamps won't work. I highly recommend keeping some in your workshop. I use it all the time. Maybe not all the time, but a lot of times, okay? And we'll take our piece of wood, line it up with the 2 tick marks. Okay, so now I know I've got a straight reference edge, and as long as I can keep my saw shoe right up to that, I'll have a straight cut. To make that a little easier, I'm going to go ahead and clamp this down to my bench top with a couple of holdfasts. Now that piece of 3/4 inch plywood was a little heavy for my cordless saw, so that's why it kept stopping on me. But as you can see, I got a nice clean cut. The same trick will work with a jigsaw. It's easier with a circular saw, but it'll work with a jigsaw too, and you'll get a straight cut every time. Number one, the scroll saw really isn't designed for straight cuts, so don't be surprised if your sides here are just a little bit off. Easy solution for that, just go ahead and put it in the vise, clean it up with a flat file. A few strokes with a flat file is going to straighten that right out for you, okay? But the other thing is that you may find your 2 pieces just don't quite fit together. Not a big surprise. Don't be surprised if it happens. Here's another place where a flat file can help us out. That and a square file. The flat file for the top and bottom. Now you want to make sure you keep your file level when you do this. You don't want to be at an angle because you're going to get an uneven cut then, all right? Now, this other side is not going to be visible when it's assembled, okay? So if you have anything that's some heavy cutting, do it on this side. You could also go back to the saw and try and clean it up on the saw, but it actually takes more finesse to do that to do the original cut. So what we're looking for is a snug fit. We want to have to work a little bit to get it in there without it being so tight that we can't. If we have a snug fit, we could actually use it without having to glue it together, which means that we can take it apart and move it somewhere else. This project is put together largely with pocket holes. So I've got my pocket hole jig out, and I'll go ahead and drill the holes. Now you got to make sure when you're doing pocket holes that you set the jig for the appropriate material thickness. In this case, 1.5 inches thick. Last project I did was 3/4 inch thick. So if I had forgotten this, it might be problematic. Now I did a pretty good talk about how to use the pocket hole jig in the project of making the clamp rack. So if you want more information about it, I'd suggest you check there. In this case, I'm drilling 2 holes in each of the sides of the sides. Okay? And I want to center it, so I've made a mark on the board, and there's a mark here on the jig for centering it. Now, different jigs are different, but they'll all have that. And I had to set my bit depth for 1.5 inch thick material, so that's important. Okay, so both the jig and the bit depth have to be set properly. truly challenging part of cutting a box, a mitered box, is setting up your table saw. I don't do a lot of these, so I'm very cautious when I do them, okay? There's a couple of things that are very critical to us here. Number one is the blade angle, and the number two is that our miter gauge is absolutely perpendicular to the blade. So let me show you what I've done to do that. First, I used a digital level for setting my saw angle, okay? And I started off by zeroing it to the table, then I attached it to the blade, swung the blade over, and measured it. Now, you can also do this with a digital protractor, like this, setting this to 0. Okay, I'm zeroing it with it closed, and then I can measure from the table to the blade, and rather than getting 45 degrees here, what I'm actually getting is 135 degrees. Why? Because I've got the 90 degrees plus the 45, okay? I also use a digital protractor, although a larger one, to set up my miter gauge, make sure it's perpendicular to the blade, but in reality what I'm doing is making sure it's perpendicular to the fence. And I set it for exactly 90 degrees, set it to my fence, and then I adjusted my miter to the gauge, okay? That's the only way you can know for sure that you're going to be absolutely right. You can't count on this gauge, you can't count on the gauge on the front of your saw. They're just not accurate enough. And if this isn't absolutely perfect, you're going to end up with gaps in your miters. The other thing that's critical here is the length of cut. And when I'm referring to that, I'm not talking about comparing the length of the cut to the drawing, because if it's a little off, you can adjust your other parts and make that work it out. What's critical here is that opposite sides have the exact same length, because if not, your miters aren't going to meet up. So what I'm setting up here is that, and I've taken a scrap piece and I've already miter cut one end, okay? Now I can set it in here, and I've attached a block to my fence, basically to use it as an auxiliary fence. And the reason I want to do that is you don't want to be running this piece up all the way up the fence with the miter, because there's a good chance of binding and kickback. So to avoid that, I'm just using this little block as an auxiliary fence as a gauge for how far over I'm going to set my piece, and I'll bring my fence up to that point, my sacrificial fence or my auxiliary fence up to that point, and lock down my fence there. Now, even if that's off what the drawing is, it's my dimension, okay? Just as long as it's big enough. So now I can run this through and cut this side, and then I can flip the board over and cut the other side, and they'll be exactly the same length. And that's what's important. And then I'll redo my setup, essentially the same thing, but for the opposite sides because they're shorter. So I'm ready to assemble the sides of my box together, and the easiest way to do that is with a little bit of painter's tape to help line the pieces up, longer than the sum of all of my sides is, okay? And then I'm going to line up the pieces on this tape, and I'll make sure that my ends, my edges, get exactly touching. Okay. So now we can apply a little glue, and if I did everything right, I should be able to just fold this up, and I didn't. This piece is upside down. Okay, let's try again. So I can fold this up, and I'll tear the excess tape off of this. I'll do one other thing here to help make sure I've got everything aligned properly, and that's to drop in the bottom, even though actually this is the top side. But that's all right, it works the same. Now I know everything's clean, and I'm going to go ahead and clamp it. Now, a lot of people wouldn't bother clamping this at this point. You can get by without clamping it as long as you've got all your seams really snug. I just like to clamp it as extra precaution. I'm not going to use a huge amount of force here. We're not talking about a structural item, we're talking about a little box. Granted, it's oak, it could handle whatever amount of pressure I put on, but I don't need a lot of pressure. One of the challenging things about making any box is making the lid and the bottom part of the box line up. And there's a really easy solution to that. And that's just that you make the box as a whole, and then you cut it apart. That's a whole lot easier than trying to make a top section and bottom section and make sure they come out right. So I've got my box all put together, and I'm bringing it over to the table saw here. And I'm not going to cut a whole lot off the top here. I'm only going to go for about 1 inch. And I'm bringing my saw blade up high enough that I can make it in 2 passes. Instead of having to go all 4 sides, I'll just go the 2 long sides. So let's go ahead and cut this. think all I need is a little hardware and it'll be done. But now you might be asking the question, okay, Rich, if you're so concerned about the end grain, why aren't you doing something about it? Good question. Now, if you're gonna paint something like this, as I'm intending to, you really have to put about 3 coats more of paint, or at least a minimum of 2, over the end grain to keep it from absorbing water. And that's because the end grain absorbs a lot more paint than the long grain does. Yeah, we could do that, but it's really hard to get that sealed off with just paint. So I'm gonna use good old caulking, painter's caulking, nothing fancy. You definitely don't want to use a caulk with silicone in it, like you would use for your kitchen or your bathroom. And I'm just applying it with my finger because that way I can rub it into the grain and smooth it out. Putting that on all the end grain seals it off. Once that's dry, I can go ahead and paint and I'll have it well sealed. Now at the same time, while I'm doing this, I'm going to go ahead and caulk the inside corners, because this is going to have dirt in it, it's going to have a plant in it, and what that means is I'm going to have water in there. And so that's another place the water could end up getting to the end grain. So I want to seal all my inside corners, making sure that they're waterproof. After all, that's what caulking's for. Now, you always want to shake stain before you use it, and I believe in wearing rubber gloves when I'm staining because I always seem to manage to get the stain on my fingers, okay? So now there's a couple different schools of thought about staining. One is that you put the stain on and you just let it dry, and doing so will give you a darker finish. Problem is that it'll take a couple days. If you're using an oil-based stain, it'll take a couple days before you can actually work with the parts. So what I generally do is I'll put the stain on and then I'll wipe it off. I get the stain comes out the color it's supposed to that way, and I don't end up with a big mess. But as you can see, I've already managed to get a mess on my hands. The grain of the wood affects the stain greatly. So the more open, the more porous the grain is, the more stain is going to soak in. What that means is that on your wood, in this case pine, some of the grain, parts of the grain are more porous than others. The other thing is that the end grain is going to soak up more stain than the long grain will. But that's part of what gives it its beauty, that variety in coloration. One of the things I'm doing fairly extensively in this design is using threaded inserts, and that's so I can insert these threaded knobs and make things adjustable. The thing about threaded inserts is that they've got to be put in exactly perpendicular. So I'm going to do my drilling on the drill press and make sure I get my holes aligned properly. The other thing that's really important is the hole size. It can be a little confusing with different types of threaded inserts because a lot of times the threading is tapered. And so you really need to drill your hole for the wider part of the taper, okay? Typically the instructions will come with the actual size when you buy the threaded inserts, but if they don't, you'll need to check with the manufacturer. Now the ones I'm using here require 23/64 hole, which is kind of an oddball size. And what I'm going to do is drill a smaller hole with a brad point bit so I can get that hole centered exactly where I want and then widen it out to the 23/64. The other thing you want to do is you want to drill the hole deeper than it needs to be so that you have clearance for the screw to go not only through the threaded part but into the material beyond. Using the brad point bit first helped me get my location more exact than I could with what is actually a fairly wide twist drill. But obviously that's not the right size, so I have to do a 2-stage drilling operation. Different threaded inserts are different. This particular one gets put in with an Allen wrench, which is actually pretty good because it gives you great leverage for putting it in. And there's not a whole lot of problem getting it straight because it's pretty much self-centering. You always want to put in threaded inserts just below flush, regardless of the type you're using. So you want to check that and make sure it's down in there. 3/4 inch thick piece of wood, we want to put a hole in, and we want to go about 2/3 of that distance, say a 1/2 inch. And we really don't want to come out the other side. Now the drill bit that's called for in the plans is what's known as a spade bit. And spade bits are a very common bit that are used for making largest holes up to roughly 2 inches in diameter, I think is the biggest I've ever seen. They work well, they're easy to use, and they're not very expensive. Okay, the problem with spade bits, as you can see from this picture here, is that the middle part, the point of the spade bit, extends quite a bit beyond the main cutting part. So if we try and go a 1/2 inch deep hole for that dowel rod, we're going to end up with the center part of the bit poking out the other side and leaving us a hole there. Is that a real issue? Well, This is a caddy. It's not something like fine furniture, okay? No, it's not an issue. But there's another kind of bit that I'd like to introduce you to, and it's called a Forstner bit, and that's the other bit here. And if you look at the cutaway, you can see that the point of that Forstner bit doesn't stick out half an inch past the main cutting area. It sticks out only about 1/8 of an inch. So what that means is if we cut that 3/4 inch hole half an inch deep, that extra 1/8 of an inch still brings us only to 5/8 of an inch deep. So we're still shy of coming out the other side. So for things like this, I prefer Forstner bits. Actually, I prefer Forstner bits in general, even though I've got a good collection of Spade bits and I do use them at times. But when I want something that I'm doing a clean hole, I find that Forstner bits work better. You don't have to have a drill press for this. You can do this with an electric hand drill. You could even do it with a manual drill of some sort, okay? One nice thing in this particular case is that this drill bit is just, this part of this drill bit is just shy of half an inch. So when I get to the point where this is just below flush, I'll know I'm at a half inch. I've got 3 different options available to me to make the hole in this piece. The Forstner bit, a Spade bit, or a hole saw. The Forstner bit gave me a pretty clean cut, even when I was going cross grain. Now, I have to say this particular bit, I know for a fact, has been on the dull side, okay? The Spade bit was really giving me a really smooth cut. It looked beautiful until I pulled out. And then the blade caught on the side of the hole, and that's where all this mess comes from. And then the hole saw looked like it was going to be pretty good, but we got a lot of burn there and a lot of chipping down on the bottom. And there's a lot of lines going through here. Now they all have the lines, but this has got the worst. The plans call for the 2 pieces to be attached together with screws, okay, at a right angle. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. Here's where the problem is though. Those screws are going to go into the end grain of this piece of wood. Now, granted, this is not a great, structural monstrosity here. It's under a lot of stress and have a lot of weight on it. It's going to have a bottle of wine on it. Okay, but what happens if somebody drops it and say it lands on that corner right there? Now we've got a lot of stress on this joint and on those screws. Now screws, when they go into end grain, cut the wood fibers, as you can see in this picture. And because they cut the wood fibers, there's really not a whole lot of strength there. And that drop can cause those screws to come loose. So what I want to do is put it together with dowel pins, okay? Now I love using dowel pins, and a lot of people are afraid to use dowel pins because, oh, you need a doweling jig and whatever. I'm going to do it without a doweling jig. I'm going to use a drill and a drill bit and some clamps and a block of wood. Now, anytime you're putting 2 pieces of wood together at an angle, you need to clamp it. So I'm just going to take a piece of 2x2 here, and I'll use that as a guide block. I've drawn a line on this side of the wood, and over here I've marked where my holes are going to be, okay? So this line is only here, so I know where to put these clamps. So now I'm going to take another pair of clamps and I'll use this pair of clamps to clamp my other piece to that same 2x2, okay? Yeah, I know it looks like a mess here with all these clamps, but what I've got is I now have it all securely clamped together, and I have access to my location for my holes on this side. So let's go ahead and drill those holes. And one of the nice things about doing this way is that if I'm a touch off on my holes, if they're not absolutely straight, it's still going to work. Now, I could just go ahead and put the dowel pins in right now, but the problem with that is that I won't have glued the 2 pieces together. The only glue will be on the dowel pins, and I don't particularly like that idea. So I've taken it back apart, and we're going to put some glue on there. Now, I'm only putting glue on one surface here. I'm not going to put it on both surfaces, partially because I probably can't do it accurately enough on that other surface. Whoops. Yeah, I slip sometimes. Drive those in, and then I'm going to clamp it this way and let the glue dry. I think I said on one of these videos that I always make a mistake on the project. Well, I did on this one too. I forgot to put glue on my dowel pins, so I just had to take it all apart, put the glue on the dowel pins, and put it all back together. Now it's clamped up and we're waiting for the glue to dry. Now there's one thing I'm uncomfortable about in the assembly of this, and that is the way it's going together is we're supposed to put the corners together first by running screws through the wheels or the casters through the first piece of wood and into the second piece of wood. Now the problem I have with that is maintaining it aligned, okay? Trying to align 3 pieces of wood, or 3 pieces, because 2 of them are wood and 1's metal, and hold them that way while I run the screws in. There's a good chance something's going to slip. And just to add to that, I'm going to go ahead and add glue in here, and that makes a pretty good lubricant, causing it to slip. Now the plans do not call for using wood glue putting this together. I personally put pretty much anything together with wood glue that I don't want to take apart again. So I'm going to go ahead and use wood glue. The way I'm going to keep it from slipping is I'm going to go ahead and glue this and tack it with some brad nail, just so that I've got something to keep it from slipping. The real holding power is going to come from the screws. I could just put it together with glue and brad nails. Yeah, that would work. But the plan calls for using the screws, and the screws are actually going to be stronger, so that's the way we're going to do it. Now I've got my framing square set out and my tri-square both, and I'm using them together to make sure I get this square, okay? It's kind of a disappointment when you put something like this together and it doesn't end up square. We're not talking about a lot of high structural strength here, so I'm not real concerned about that. And I'm going to line these pieces up. Again, I'm using my squares to keep everything straight, and I can already feel that trying to slip. So now with that all tacked together, I don't have to worry about slipping. I can concentrate on locating my casters, not keeping the wood aligned, okay? And I'm using a square of my own manufacture. All this is a cut-off corner with 2 pieces of plywood attached to it. The key to this is making sure you have a corner here that you're working with that is exactly 90 degrees. I have several different sizes of these that I've made at one time or another that I use for a variety of different things. If I was to put this together without that, I might get it off a little bit. Okay, I could live with that as long as I finish my assembly work, but it would mean my screws are going to here crooked, and while I can straighten that back out, it just puts extra stress on the wood. Could lead to, over the long term, early failure. So I'd rather go ahead and use something to hold it square. We always try and assemble things not only with screws, but with glue as well. Ultimately, the glue is actually giving you the majority of your bond. The instructions did not specify a screw size. I'm using 1 1/4 inch long screws, and the reason I'm using that particular size is that my wood is 3/4 of an inch thick, so that means I've got about a 1/2 inch of screw going into the connecting piece, and that's about right. That's enough to hold it. Let me tell you one thing about dowel rods, and that is they aren't necessarily the size they're said to be, okay? This is supposed to be a 3/4 inch dowel rod, but when I tried to fit it into the hole, it wouldn't fit. I actually had to sand the edge, and you just take a piece of sandpaper and run it about 20 or 30 revolutions in your hand like that, and that's probably going to be enough to make it fit. It'll fit tight, but it'll still fit, okay? We can go ahead and put a little bit of glue on here, and it does not take much. And we'll put our glue on this piece. You notice I'm not spreading this glue out with my fingers. It's kind of a rustic, sort of rough piece, so that's not something that's so much of a concern as it would be if I was making a piece of furniture. Still have a little trouble getting that to close up. So I'm just going to put a bar clamp on here and use it as a persuader. You could also stand it up on its end and hit it with a hammer. That would essentially do the same thing. There's a thing in woodworking called dry fitting. And the idea is you put something together the way it's going to go together and clamp it up and do it all without the glue. You do that before you put the glue in, just to make sure everything's going to fit together properly. And this is a great project for that because we've got so many pieces that have got to go together all at the same time. It's not like we can do part of it and then another part of it. We've actually got to put everything together all at the same glue up. So what I want to do is get my dowel rods in place. Here's my bottom piece. Now there's more space between the dowel rods and top because the bottle's got to fit there. So this is my bottom piece. Now I'm going to go ahead and set it in here. And I've got to spread my pieces out just enough to get it in there. And here's my top piece. And as you can see, just trying to get that top piece in place caused my dowels to pop out, which is what I can expect when I get around to doing it with the glue. Okay, so I can see that all my parts fit together the way they're supposed to. So now I can take it back apart, put the glue in there, and put it together. I've just got a couple pieces of scrap here, but I want to show you a very real problem that can exist for gluing these together. PVA wood glue, that's the common wood glue that we use for making projects, is a very good lubricant. And so when I clamp these pieces together, what's probably going to happen is that they're going to slide, okay? So I've gone ahead and outlined this piece in black just to make it more visible. As you can see right now, it's not visible. Okay, now here's what happens when I go to put a clamp on it. Okay, the first clamp went pretty good. Here's our second clamp. and it's starting to slide. You see this little black edge right here? That's from the clamp pushing it and causing it to slide. We got a little bit of a black edge here. So when it comes to our actual clock, that can be a problem. Rather than dealing with that problem and maybe having to do a lot of sanding to make up for it, I'm going to use CA glue, good old super glue, to put this together. Now the super glue is used in woodworking, although it's not as common as regular PVA glue. The one thing, it's used in times like this when we need to get a good positive glue and we need to get it quickly. I'm also going to use an accelerator with this, which means that it's going to dry very, very quickly. The risk with using the accelerator is that it's going to be grabbing as soon as it touches. So you got to be very careful with your alignment when you put things together using super glue and an accelerator. That is already bonded, even though it doesn't look like it. Nevertheless, I'm going to go ahead and clamp it and leave it sitting clamped for about an hour. That's so that the glue can fully set. Yes, it's set now, but in reality, it finishes hardening over time. Now with all our pieces cut, we're ready to assemble them, and I'm going to use a combination of glue and finishing nails to hold this together. One nice thing about this design is it's pretty strong, okay? And one of the things you want to do with this type of a thing is, you know, any board's going to have a long grain and an end grain, right? We want to try and hide the end grain as much as possible. And typically we do that by butting it into another piece of wood some way or another. This design doesn't really allow for that because our frame has the two of the sides going all the way. So what we want to do is put those sides in such a way that the end grain isn't going to be easily visible without somebody craning their neck or something. So we have a side piece and a bottom piece. We're going to butt the bottom piece into the side piece. The only way they're going to see then the end grain is to get under there. Okay, same with the top. You know, they have to get real high up. Now, if we did it the other way around, all they've got to do is step past it and look back and they see the end grain. So that's something we always want to keep in mind when we're designing a project is how are we going to hide that end grain? In this case, we're going to kind of be deceptive about it, not in a bad way, but just we're just going to hide it by putting it where people aren't likely to look. So I'm using corner clamps to hold my pieces, and the reason I'm using corner clamps is because I don't trust myself. I'm not going to get it lined up just right otherwise. And corner clamps are not expensive, good investment. So I'm not going to put a lot of glue because I really don't want squeeze out. I'm not in a situation where I can clean up the squeeze out. Okay, remember I've got a front side and a back side, so I want to make sure I leave my front side showing. Okay, I picked those out, and I can look right here and I can see, I think I put the wrong side up on that one. So fortunately, all I had was the glue there, and I hadn't gotten around to putting the nails in. Easy mistake to make. Don't lose track of what part of your wood you're using when you're putting something together. Okay, so now that I've got those in place, all I got to do is put a couple of finishing nails in here very carefully, make sure they don't go crooked. I'm using 2-inch finish nails because my wood is 1.5 inches, and 2 inches is the longest size I can use with my finish nailer. So now I can flip this around, and, wrong piece, and take my other side piece, and we can do the exact same thing. Getting ready to run these boards through the planer just to smooth them out. Now if you don't have a planer, you don't have to use a planer to do this. You can do it with a sander. Probably a belt sander or even a random orbital sander will do it. I'm using the planer because I have it available. But because they're so little, they really don't run through a planer well. So what I'm doing is I'm gluing them to a larger board, which means that they'll run through together as a pair. But the other thing that's going to do for me is that it's going to help, not only is it going to help get them leveled out, but it's going to help eliminating what's called snipe. Now snipe is a place towards the end of your board as you're coming through the planer, if I'm going in this way, where you get more of a cut because of it coming off the wheels. Okay, There's some rollers in there that help make sure that your piece is pressed down against the table. All right, so what I'm doing here is I've got a couple pieces of scrap. This is actually some cut off from some trim. You can use literally anything for this. And I'm gluing them on here. Now these stick up just a touch higher than the highest point I've got here, so it's going to cut these first. But the other thing is, as I'm feeding through, when I get to the end, that area that would be snipe is right here. So I might get snipe in these, and I don't care, because when I get done, I'm throwing them away. These will come out of it good. And then, because I'm using hot melt glue to hold it on, it can all come apart. And you can clean the hot melt glue off the base piece of wood, and it's ready to be used for something else. The best possible saw for cutting these boards out is a scroll saw. A scroll saw is generally a benchtop tool, or some people put them on a stand. It's designed for cutting tight curves, and that's what makes it so great for this. We have some curves that are fairly tight, and we need to get them cut as clean as possible. We can always sand them later to make it a little better, but we really want to get them as good as possible. If you don't have a scroll saw, another option is a bandsaw. Although a bandsaw is going to have a hard time with these tight curves, you're probably going to have to cut it like segmented and then sand it. Using a narrower blade on a bandsaw is beneficial. The other option is a jigsaw, which is a handheld electric tool. Jigsaws work. I'm not overly fond of them, and the main reason for that is because it's very, very easy when you're using a jigsaw to put sideways pressure on that blade and actually bend the blade. And not only does it ruin the blade, but you end up with a crooked cut. So you have to be careful using it, but they will work. And for years and years and years before I had a scroll saw, that's what I used, okay? Now, one of the things we want to make sure of is that we have the right blade in. Blades are measured in the number of teeth that are in the blade. And I realize this is probably not that visible on the camera, but this blade here has got about 20 teeth per inch, and this one's got about 10 teeth per inch. You want a minimum of 3 teeth for the material thickness. So if I hold this up to the side of my material here, I actually have about 5 or 6 teeth. That'll work good. Now, why would I want to use that instead of the finer tooth blade? Because what's going to happen with this finer tooth blade is that the teeth are going to get filled up with sawdust, and the blade isn't going to cut as well. So a blade with larger teeth is going to actually cut through this material better than the smaller. Since I have so many 22-inch pieces to cut, I'm going to set myself up a stop block so that I don't have to take the time to measure each and every one. All I've got to do is run the board up to the stop block and then cut it off. I've prepared my saw blade for my table saw for cutting all these branches for this tree by sticking on a self-adhesive sanding disc. Now, a lot of people don't use this anymore. It's pretty much been replaced by the hook and loop or Velcro type. But I have a lot of these left over from before that came out, and I still use them. So I put a disc on either side. Now, if you don't have those, you can do the same thing using regular sanding paper and some spray-on adhesive. But the idea here is as the blade cuts the wood, it's also going to sand those edges and should leave me with a nice smooth edge that I don't have to run through the joiner or planer in order to have it ready to use. I had a choice here whether I could cut my 1x4s down to length first and then cut it into strips on the table saw, or cut it into strips on the table saw and then cut it down to length. Because of space limitations in my shop, I decided it made more sense to cut it off to length first on the radial arm saw and then rip them down to size on the table saw. A lot of times when you drill holes through wood, especially softwoods like this pine, you end up with a little of this fuzz sticking up here, and that's just splinters that haven't really severed from the wood. You can get on the back side as well. There's a couple things you can do about it. One is you can just try and knock it off with your fingers, like cut it with your fingernail. Another is to use, this is a deburring tool. It's actually a machinist deburring tool for metal, but it works pretty good for taking that fuzz out of there. But probably the easiest thing is chuck a countersink up in your drill press, and or your hand drill, and don't even bother making it go up and down. Just bring the wood up to it. So I told you I was going to show you an easy way to come up with the 2-inch circular piece for the trunk. And what I'm going to use is a hole saw. If you look at the hole saw, you see that the hole saw's wall thickness is 1/16 of an inch, okay? So if I take this hole saw, this is a 2-inch hole saw, and I run it through a piece of wood, I'm going to get a hole that's 2 inches. Well, this hole saw is 2 1/8 of an inch. And if we take that 2 1/8 of an inch, obviously the hole will be 2 1/8 of an inch, but we subtract that wall thickness and the plug that's left is going to be 2 inches. And that's what we're after. So I can drill through and get my 2-inch plug. Now I'm actually going to do 2 of these, and I'm going to glue them together. And I'm only going to drill halfway through from one side, or maybe about 2/3 of the way, flip it over and drill it from the other side. That just makes it easier to get my plug out of there once I've flipped it over. So there's my 2-inch circle. So I've got a piece of, this is about 10.5-inch square by 1.5-inch thick pine here, okay? And I'm gonna make my base out of this. Now, you can make your base any shape that you want, but I'm gonna go ahead and make a star. And I don't have a star pattern that big, so I need to create a star pattern. And it's actually very easy to draw a 5-pointed star. So I'm gonna start off with a compass. If you don't have a good compass, I'd recommend getting one. So I'm going to just draw a circle. You can see I've got an X drawn already on this piece of wood, and that X just is there to show me where the center is. So I can set my compass in place. I'm trying to make this circle dark enough that I'll be able to see it easily. Okay, so I've got my circle. Now, 5-point star, there's 360 degrees in a circle. That means 360 divided by 5 gives us 72 degrees, okay? So I can take a protractor and line it up along either of these lines. I'm just going to use this one because it's here. And here's my 0, and I can go 72 degrees, and that puts me right here, okay? And I can go another 72, that would be 144 degrees. Here's 140, 144, okay? Now I could keep adding, but I can cheat and I can go the other way, so I don't have to do all that adding. I can do the same thing going the other direction from my same starting point right here. So 72 degrees, 60, 70, 72, and 144. Okay. Now if I measure this angle between here and here, I'll get 72 degrees as well. So now that I've got that, I can draw from the center out through each of those tick marks to my circle. There's one, okay? Okay, now, the only one of my original lines I need is this one. So here's my 5 points of my star. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? Nothing else matters. Those 5 points. And now it's just a matter of playing connect the dots. So we connect each of these points to the 2 points that are not next to it. So I don't want this to connect to here or here. I just want it to connect here and here. And there's my 5-pointed star. Now I just need to go over and cut it out on the bandsaw. So I've got my star cut out and my circle for my trunk. At the bottom, one way we can do it is just butt it up here and then go ahead and nail it through. That works, but we might end up with some gaps, especially if our panels aren't glued absolutely perfect. Second way is to put it on top and then glue up and nail up through the bottom. That leaves the edges of the plywood exposed, which really isn't a problem because we got a piece of trim that's going to cover it up. So that's a second possibility. The third possibility is to take the panel and use a router to cut a rabbet in the edge of it and allow it to overlap. And I've actually cut the rabbet a little too deep so that the panel can set up a little bit. This is a much neater configuration. We won't end up with any gaps. We won't end up with anything showing, even if our panels don't match up perfectly. So that's what I've chosen to do. Assembling the box itself is fairly easy. I'm using corner clamps to make sure I get a 90-degree corner. I've only got 2 corner clamps. I don't have 4 like we need to go all the way around. But that's not a problem because what I'm going to do is I'll make 2 sub-assemblies and then I'll put the 2 sub-assemblies together. So what I'm doing with the corner clamp is setting my pieces in place and I'm making sure I have an overlap. Now the overlap in this design is important. Rather than going with mitered corners, I'm going with square corners and I'm going to overlap one piece over the other. The tricky thing is I've got to make sure I maintain that same overlap all the way around. So if I'm going here like the hidden piece, the piece that's closer to me, overlapping the other piece, then I need to continue going that way all the way around. Otherwise my box is going to end up out of square. Once I dry fit the pieces together, I take them apart, squeeze some glue in there, and then smooth the glue out with my finger, put the piece back in, clamp it, make sure it's aligned well, and then I'm going to nail it with an air nailer. Now, if you don't have an air nailer, it's not a problem. You can do the exact same thing with screws. I'm using the air nailer because I have it. It's easy, it's quick, and actually it's a good investment. With both sub-assemblies made, I can now use my 2 corner clamps to connect them together. So I'm just going to use the corner clamps on the 2 sides that need to be connected together. Now again, I've got to maintain that overlap. That's the most important thing I've got to do here. Make sure that I keep my overlap direction going the same. If not, I'm going to end up with a box that's out of square. So first I dry fit the various pieces together to make sure everything's going to fit together properly, and I've got my clamp set properly. Then I'll take it back apart, put glue on the joints, set the pieces together, and go ahead and nail them together with the air nailer once again. According to the plans I came up with for this Ottoman, the legs are tapered. And I did that mostly so that they would go well with the sofa that this is going with. And so I've cut some little blocks of just 2x2 pine here, 3 inches long. Obviously they're not tapered, so I need to taper them, and I'm going to do that on the table saw. I've set my blade angle to about 12 degrees. That wasn't an exact, that was more like that's about what I want. But the big thing is I came up with this little jig here. Now, when the table saw can be extremely dangerous. The one injury I've had with a power tool was to my thumb. I actually split the bone there on a table saw, and that was years and years ago. You really got to watch out for that blade. And you notice I don't have a blade guard here like I should, and that's mostly because I can't see the piece or get the piece in there with the blade guard. So what I had to do is come up with something that would hold my block of wood, because trying to hold this with your finger in place, that's really risky, okay? And it's likely to wobble a little bit and not going to get a clean cut anyway. So all this is 3 pieces of wood put together to make like a corner of a box. And then I've added a little bridge to go over the top of my fence, which will just keep it from coming out this way. This allows me to clamp the block that I'm going to be cutting to the front edge, so that it's right here at the blade, and my hand's all the way back here out of the way. Now the only thing that could be risky here is the clamp getting in the blade. So I want to make sure that my clamp's really tight so it doesn't loosen up as I start my cut. So now you can see the first cut here. I've tapered this side. So now I want to taper one more side to match it. We'll go ahead and loosen the clamp up. Set this back in place. And I'm going to cut this side. It really doesn't matter which side, just as long as I have two adjacent sides. And the reason I'm only worried about two sides is because the other two sides are going to be towards the inside where they won't even be visible. So as long as I manage to taper two sides effectively, I'm going to end up with a good tapered leg for this piece of furniture. Again, I want to make sure I get the clamp good and tight, okay? And we'll go ahead and cut that one. But before I glue and nail this in place, I want to go ahead and attach the legs because it'll be a whole lot easier. So we're just going to set this aside. And this will be the bottom side. And I want to put my legs inset, say 1.5 inches from the edge. Now, I want them square and I want them dimension right, and I've got to attach them from the other side. So the best way to make sure that this comes out right is take a couple little blocks of wood and attach them here, and that gives me like a little pocket that I can set into, okay? So we'll apply a little glue. Now some people tell you you can't glue Endgrain of wood because it doesn't hold. Well, in testing it does. The only thing I'd say is put a little more glue than you normally would, okay? I'm not bothering to spread it around with my fingers simply because I've put enough glue there that I'm sure it's going to spread around. And now with the blocks holding it lined up exactly where I want, and I've put it 180 degrees out because I've got my bevel to the inside instead of the other side. Remember what I said about measure twice, cut once? Well, that goes for screwing and nailing and everything else too. So now with it in place, I can nail it. And what the nails are doing more than anything else is holding it together while the glue dries.